It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This episode is brought to you by HP Instant Ink. No one is reading your mind, but HP Instant Ink knows when your printer is running low and sends new cartridges before you run out. So you never have to think about ink. For details, visit hp.com/instant ink Spotify. Conditions apply.
You are Locked On Wildcats, your daily podcast on the Arizona Wildcats. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Thursday, and thanks for keeping it Locked On Wildcats. I'm your host, Mike Luke, joined by the great John Schuster, who is now back from meandering around the Four Corners region, as Shu does. What have you been up to, Shu?
In fairness, it's probably more like meandering around the Three Corners region. What do you think I'm doing up in Cortez, Colorado, checking up the Red Rocks?
Ogden, Utah.
Boy, your geography's amazing.
Not good. Not good.
You know that the Locked On Podcast Network is based in Utah, right?
Oh, I know, because the actual head, David Locke, is the head of it, yes.
Yeah, David Locke, who's the head.
Don't come into Locked On Podcast without thinking that I know my background.
I have a feeling that David Locke understands that Ogden, Utah is nowhere near the Four Corners region.
You know what?
Or where I was, much closer to Las Vegas.
Man, let's not pretend like you don't know David Locke. But, I'm glad that I got you here, Schuster, because as you all know, this show is brought to you by rockauto.com. If anybody's listened let's be honest here, if anybody's listened at all, you know that we speak very highly of rockauto.com because of the simplicity of rockauto.com. If there's anything more simple than the name rockauto.com, it is the process you go through getting their parts. That is how rockauto.com is. All right, that being said, I was listening to some Arizona Wildcats baseball and softball over the last couple weeks, and I noticed a new voice on the air, which we're going to get to here shortly. But it got me to thinking, though, when Arizona athletics has really been blessed over the last, obviously we'll get to Brian Jeffries in a second, but even before him,
Ray Scott.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then Ryan Radke obviously had a role here, which we'll get to. You're friendly with Ryan, so we can speak to that. Is this just something that Tucson was lucky to be able to get so many guys that are just at the top of their game? Or is this something where, you know what, you're a town of 1 million plus, you should be getting greatness?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I necessarily have the answer to you, but for you in that capacity, but it certainly is right in front of us. As far as sports broadcasting is concerned, Tucson's had, and play-by-play broadcasting especially, Tucson's been a very fortunate market. And it's been a market that has been used as a springboard for a number of those people. And it's a market where some very talented people, obviously Brian Jeffries, is the paramount example here. Jeffries has been the voice of the Wildcats since the mid-'80s. Mm-hmm. So you have a guy there who Wildcat fans rightfully adore because he's good at what he does, and that's some nice continuity to have. But what's been interesting is because Brian has been in that job for so long that there are other people who have sort of kind of worked their way through that have also been very talented but have moved on to other markets to try to cultivate a skill set. Because really from a play-by-play standpoint, once you get past what it is that Jeffries does, to a lesser extent Derek Palmer, who does the women's basketball games, and some other fill-in, since the Toros left, there aren't that many play-by-play opportunities. The guy who does Roadrunners broadcast is very good. And very often what Tucson is in that market, when you look at the Toros, you look at now the relatively newly formed Roadrunners. Right. You have individuals who are hoping to broadcast at a professional level, utilizing it as the farm job that it is, hoping that positions that rarely open up ultimately do here and there, and they'll have a shot at playing in the bigs or talking about the bigs.
Briefly, because I don't think a lot of people know who Ray Scott is, obviously, here, and that's not going to be the tenor, because I want to talk about Brian Jeffries, Ryan Radke, and then somebody that I see emerging onto the scene here. But just briefly, who was Ray Scott, and And how is Arizona so lucky to have such a transition going from a guy in Ray Scott that you hold in very high esteem?
We'll work that backward. Brian Jeffries is probably more equipped to answer why Ray Scott was ultimately in Tucson. I'm betting it was some sort of retirement thing. But Scott is a nationally renowned broadcaster who did not only Wildcat games, but regional games, and again, some broadcasts on a much larger scale. Professional announcer who Arizona was lucky enough to have. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. Again, if you have Jeffries on and want to discuss this a little bit further, I believe Ray Scott was his mentor. And Jeffries was in the right position at the right time once Scott ultimately retired to move into that position. And now himself has been mentor for a lot of other broadcasters.
Now, let me ask you this. What makes, because for somebody like me who just kind of gives his opinion on air, but, I didn't come up, my background isn't broadcast journalism. Everything is print, writing, education, etc. What makes somebody like Brian Jeffries so good at what he does?
The ability to paint a picture so that the listener can have a fair understanding as to the way that the play went down. Interestingly, a couple days ago, I was listening to Radke, coincidentally, on a national broadcast for the women's softball final. I think it was Game 1, Florida State, Oklahoma, if I'm not mistaken. And there was a weird play at the plate that involved a confusing rule. There are all kinds of moving parts, and Radke did a remarkable job concisely explaining what it was that happened in that play so that the listener, who would obviously be confused because they don't have eyes on the product, was able to understand all of those moving parts. That is what is required to be a good play-by-play guy. And different sports require very different skill sets. Baseball is a lot different than basketball, which is a lot different than hockey, which is a lot different than football. So if you can get a guy who does something and does it well across platforms, then you've really got something special, and Arizona does in Jeffries. Jeffries is very good. One of the interesting questions, I think, I'm not sure Brian would answer it, what his favorite sport is to broadcast, or the sport that he thinks he's the best at broadcasting. I know, because Radke and I have talked about this sort of thing. Ryan, for those who are unfamiliar, used to do
and we're going to hit on Ryan here.
Some broadcasting at the University of Arizona in a kind of like network pre- and post-game capacity, and occasionally did play-by-plays. Always wanted to do play-by-play. Always wanted to do baseball play-by-play. Got a job with Nevada in Reno, and over the last few years has been with Westwood One.
Right.
So if you listen to sports
Thursday night
radio,
football, Monday night football, you're going to hear
a lot of college games, you're going to hear Radke.
Right.
So he was somebody who needed to leave the market to work his way up, and was very successful in doing so. But he's also very good at. He's a baseball guy. He's a baseball play-by-play guy who can do basketball very well and does football very well. But I think the game that he prefers to do is baseball. It's very impressive if you can get someone who can do those core sports well.
With a seamless transition.
Yeah, with a reasonably seamless transition from sports to sport. Now, I think it's fair to say that Jeffries does a very good job.
Now, on the other side, I wanted to express something about somebody that I've noticed coming up, and I thought about something that you said to me a while back. And for anybody out there that doesn't know, John Schuster is one of my best friends. We've been talking about this kind of stuff for probably 7-8 years. I love picking his mind. And the one thing too about John Schuster is that he's not opposed to betonline.ag, and I might give you a name to remember in here. Now, this name might not come up on betonline.ag, but this is a guy, though, that you should keep an eye on in the future. Keep it locked on Wildcats. Thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats. I'm your host, Mike Luke, joined by John Schuster. We're talking about the privilege that we all in Tucson have of, I think, being very lucky in the amount of great commentators that we've had surrounding the U of A program. And you mentioned something a while back to me about Ryan Radke, who, again, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. I think it's fair to say you're friends with Ryan.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said something about Ryan that when you were working in the radio business, mm-hmm. that when you came across Ryan, you knew that he he was destined for something big. He was destined for something big. He just had that feel to him.
Sometimes it's not hard to see it.
Right.
And there's somebody who happens to be in the building. Ryan was in college. I was working at one of the local radio stations here doing political talk with another individual who a lot of Tucsonans have heard on and off doing some broadcasting, Eric Tomei. Tomei and I had a radio show that briefly ran in the late 90s on KNST when that radio station had the Wildcat contract. Radke was an intern who was still going to the U of A, so he had done some work at camp, and he comes in, and it's not hard to tell within 30 seconds, oh, holy crap.
You know, that's what I think we're looking at right here with a guy named Brody Dryden. Now, I've been fortunate enough to be around Brody, and I would definitely not call myself a mentor because he came in knowing way more than even I knew. But Brody has filled in a little bit for Brian doing some baseball games. He's done some softball games as well. And when you listen to Brody, and he's a younger guy, you can just tell he gets it at a level that is very natural. When you watch, his cadence is perfect. He knows the players, like you talked about. He can paint a scene. And I had two people tell me this when I was talking to a couple people about this, that he sounds and his delivery is a lot like Ryan Radke. Now, again, I don't know what Brody's goals are, but I do know that this is a guy that in one way, shape, or form, if he stays around U of A athletics, that this city is going to be very blessed to have, because just like you were talking about with Ryan Radke, and you come about it from a far more technical expertise type role than I do, this is just somebody in Brody who gets it, and you can just tell is destined for big things. Now, I wanted to kind of go back to Ryan, and then we'll get back to Brody here in a second. But when you first came across Ryan, and you said it took about 25 to 30 seconds, what did you mean by that?
You could tell by the voice jumps off the page at you. That doesn't hurt. If you have that kind of voice, it's good. There was also a mature professionalism that he had. He was very respectful. He was willing to listen, willing to engage. He had give and take capabilities, and you could just tell as the conversation went along and as our relationship progressed that he had good knowledge about a lot of things and had an ability to tell a story in the concise way that's necessary to be a play-by-play broadcaster, which is interesting in that during the course of his career to try to ultimately get into play-by-play, Ryan had to do talk radio. Talk radio is much different in terms of telling a story than you have to. You can tell a story.
Is it a good training ground?
It can be. I think talk radio is a great training ground for everything. But one of the things you have to be aware of, and sometimes, frankly, in a mode of self-scouting, since you and I have done these podcasts, my day-to-day broadcasting has been significantly less than it used to be. So in terms of self-scouting, I have noticed that I still have a tendency to fill time, which is something that takes place in classic traditional talk radio.
Don't do it on this 18-minute podcast right here for Locked On Wildcats.
Right. So there's a 6-minute block or a 12-minute block that you've got to fill this space for. You have to be able to tell that story in a broadcast within one pitch. So you're looking at or one football play, or as a basketball play is moving from one side of the court to another. You're talking about, instead of telling a story in 12 minutes, telling a Cliff Notes version of that story in 20 seconds. And it's a very different skill set that challenges you in different ways. And so is it a good training ground to be a talk radio? Always. It helps you fill space, especially in weird situations. There's an injury on the field, there's something that the lights are out in a football game. Talk to Jeffries, who has done this for 35 years, about the weirdest things he's come across in regards to time that he's had to fill. And having some sort of talk radio ability probably doesn't hurt, but the skill set is very different. And to be good, the difference between play-by-play saying it in 20 seconds and talk radio saying it in 12 minutes, it's a lot more challenging than you might think.
I've got an interesting story that kind of dovetails off of what you just talked about right there. And you talked about the maturity and just kind of the command and presence. I'm somebody now in my mid-30s. When I first met Brody, who is more than 10 years younger than me, I came away thinking that I was talking to somebody, and again, I knew his age, but I came away thinking that I was talking to somebody in his mid-40s. Just because here I am, making just kind of dumb side talk, and again, he's got a great sense of humor. It's very dry. It's a little bit like Brian in that regard. But I just came away thinking this man has a presence about him. And when I got to hear him do the baseball games, commentate in the way he did, I just came away thinking to myself that, man, Arizona, and again, I have no clue what the chain of succession would ever be. I'm just talking about somebody that I think has a very bright future here in the game. I just came away thinking to myself, man, Arizona athletics has had it really, really good. And I remember talking to you about it, about how good Ray Scott was. And then obviously Brian's work speaks for itself.
So you're looking at 40 years of having really good broadcasting in a town the size of Tucson.
In a town, and that's, I think, the other
And
key.
sometimes if you listen to college play-by-play guys, some of them, a lot of them are good. Some of them are clearly better than others. For instance, the guy at ASU, Tim Healy, has been ASU's broadcaster for at least 30 years, nearly as long as. Really good guy, really good at what he does. So ASU in that regard is kind of lucky too. But Jeffries is every bit the talent that Healy is in a big market in Phoenix.
Right.
Jeffries could work at any college other than the kitschy colleges.
Right.
Like broadcasters have a little trademark, sort of like the SEC.
Right.
The guy at Alabama is just sort of what you'd expect for an Alabama. It's not so much. It's almost that he's putting on theater more than he's providing play-by-play.
He's providing the professionalism, not that he's unprofessional.
The Yankees baseball announcer is a theater announcer as opposed to necessarily a play-by-play guy. So there's a very different approach. Jeffries is a straight-ahead, very good, very talented play-by-play guy. So maybe Jeffries doesn't necessarily play in Alabama, but he's going to play at a hell of a lot of really good universities, and the U of A has been absolutely lucky to have him.
And so again,
and Ray Scott, like you said, they were lucky to have Ray Scott. And if you if you have a guy potentially on deck,
right,
that is of Dryden's apparent capabilities, then that's a very nice thing to potentially have. Dryden reminds me quickly of, and this is going to be a little bit of inside radio, so bear with me here. I've spent a lot of time in radio in a number of capacities and kind of view it from a technical standpoint. Wrote a Media Watch column, so I can see radio in a variety of different ways, including from a behind-the-scenes production standpoint and an understanding of broadcast standpoint. Even if I'm not as good as some of those guys, I have an understanding of what it is that they do better than I do and do very well. Dryden, there are two guys who you deal with on a fairly regular basis who have direct radio connections. They understand the business from being 5 years old. And that's your friend Ben White, who is clearly a radio guy.
Right.
No question about it. He was there's no question. Even if I didn't know Ben White's dad, I could tell listening to him, listening to the production,
he gets the nuance.
Listening to the way that things come across, Ben White knows radio. Brody Dryden knows radio.
Right.
He knows play-by-play. He has the background necessary that you can't teach at a college, generally speaking, can't teach at a college level
something you're
without
immersed
You're immersed in it, or you're a natural talent in the process. Being immersed in it goes a long way to helping that.
The reason for this entire podcast, and again, a little bit off topic because we generally get to sports, but I just wanted the Arizona fans out there to kind of have an appreciation for how lucky, because I think that can kind of get understated at times, and just to know that no matter what happens, and again, I don't know what Brody's plans are, I've never even really asked him, but one way or the other, that's definitely a name to keep an eye on. We're going to be back with you tomorrow, and as always, thanks for keeping it locked on Wildcats.